Maria Filippone ordered the death of her own cousin on March 14, 1981, 3 weeks after he skimmed $40,000 from a Gambino-controlled numbers operation in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. He was found in the trunk of a stolen Buick Riviera on 86th Street with 2 rounds from a .38 behind his left ear. The FBI's public record describes Filippone as a peripheral figure, a bookkeeper, a wife, a woman who answered phones. The Gambino family's own internal hierarchy, reconstructed through wiretap transcripts entered into evidence during the 1992 Eastern District racketeering trial, listed her as a controlling authority over 3 separate revenue streams. Sealed grand jury testimony from 1988 names 4 witnesses who placed Filippone at the table during sit-downs that determined which union locals the family would infiltrate next. 3 of those witnesses died before they could testify at trial, and the 4th recanted in open court without explanation. Hollywood took one look at a woman running a crew and turned her into a tragic figure defined by the men around her, a grieving widow, a reluctant participant, a mother protecting her children. Maria Filippone was none of those things. She was a deliberate architect of organized violence who spent 19 years building a criminal infrastructure that outlasted every man who underestimated her. The NYPD's Organized Crime Control Bureau flagged her name as early as 1976, then removed her from active surveillance files in 1979 after pressure from a source that the Bureau's own internal review, completed in 2003, described only as a politically sensitive contact within the department. This is the story Hollywood never told you, and it is far darker than anything the screen put on front of you. Maria Concetta Filippone was born on September 3, 1944, in a 3-room apartment above a butcher shop on Bay Ridge Avenue in Brooklyn, the second of 6 children born to Salvatore Filippone, a longshoreman with debts to a Colombo-affiliated loan shark named Pietro Arcuri. By the time Maria was 11, her father owed Arcuri $900, and Arcuri collected by taking Saturdays, meaning Salvatore worked the docks on his one day off and handed the cash directly to a man who sat in a car outside and never spoke. Every dramatization of Filippone's origins portrays her family as connected, as if criminality was inherited wealth passed down at the dinner table. The reality documented in her 1992 pre-sentencing report is that she grew up watching her father humiliated by men with power, and she decided before she was a teenager that she would never be on that side of the transaction. In October 1963, at 19 years old, Filippone walked into the Bay Ridge Social Club of Carmine Agnello Sr., not the man later associated with the Gotti family, but an older figure of the same name, and told him directly that his card game on Union Street had a dealer who was marking 10s and jacks with a thumbnail scratch on the upper right corner. She had identified the cheat herself, tracked the pattern over 6 weeks, and arrived with a written log of every hand she had observed where the marked cards appeared. Agnello had the dealer beaten and gone within 48 hours, and he gave Filippone $200 and a permanent seat in the operations back office. By 1971, Filippone controlled the accounting for a numbers bank that processed over 14,000 individual bets per week across 4 Brooklyn neighborhoods, a volume that the FBI's own financial analysis, completed in 1993 and never publicly released, estimated generated between $2.3 million and $2.9 million annually in net profit. No Hollywood production has ever put that number on screen because it forces a reckoning with how large her operation actually was before she was 40 years old. Every film and series that has brushed against her story presents her rise as accidental. The widow who stepped in when her husband died in 1977. Her husband, Domenico Filippone, was irrelevant to the operation by 1974, and the wiretap logs from the FBI's abscam-adjacent surveillance in 1979 contain 31 conversations in which senior Gambino figures discuss business with Maria directly, without a single reference to Domenico, who was still alive at the time. Brooklyn in the late 1960s operated under a criminal franchise system that most people today misunderstand completely. The five families did not control territory the way a government controls land. They controlled relationships, and the relationships that mattered most were with the men who ran legitimate businesses: trucking dispatchers, union stewards, wholesale food distributors, and the city inspectors who decided which restaurants passed and which ones paid. The man who shaped Filippone's understanding of that system was not a made member or a capo. He was a Queens-based accountant named Russell Dentino, who handled the books for three separate family-adjacent operations between 1965 and 1972, and who taught Filippone the single most important principle she would ever apply. The money that cannot be traced is not the money you hide. It is the money that was never recorded as existing in the first place. Dentino was indicted in 1972 on federal tax conspiracy charges and cooperated with prosecutors, which should have destroyed every operation he touched. Instead, Filippone had already spent 2 years quietly restructuring the numbering system, the collection routes, and the payment ledgers so that her name appeared nowhere and Dentino's cooperation produced nothing actionable against her specifically. The prosecutors got Dentino's clients. They did not get Filippone, because by the time Dentino sat down with the FBI, she had already become invisible. What she inherited from the post-Dentino collapse was not money or territory. It was a vacuum. Every operator who had relied on Dentino's accounting infrastructure was suddenly exposed, and Filippone moved into that space not with violence, but with a replacement service. She offered 3 different family-adjacent operations a new bookkeeping system, took a percentage of each, and inside 18 months controlled the financial nerve center of operations she did not nominally run. The woman that Hollywood portrays as inheriting power from men actually built her position by making herself indispensable to men who had no idea how dependent on her they had become. Filippone ran 3 distinct revenue operations simultaneously, and none of them looked like what most people picture when they think about organized crime. The first was the numbers operation, which by 1978 had expanded beyond Brooklyn into Staten Island's North Shore through a network of 63 runners, most of them women who worked as home health aides, cleaning staff, and school cafeteria employees, professions that gave them daily access to the elderly, the working poor, and the institutionally invisible, demographics the FBI almost never surveilled. The second was a hijacking coordination service, which is a phrase that requires explanation. Filippone did not organize the physical theft of trucks. She sold information. Specifically, she maintained a contact inside the Port Authority of New York who provided cargo manifests 24 hours before shipment, and she sold those manifests to crews who paid her a flat fee of $8,000 per actionable tip, regardless of what the cargo was worth. Between 1974 and 1981, federal investigators later estimated she brokered information on at least 47 separate hijackings, generating a minimum of $376,000 in direct fees without ever touching a truck or a loading dock. The third operation was the one that made her genuinely dangerous to the institutions investigating her. She ran a loan operation that specifically targeted small business owners who had been denied credit by banks and who needed capital to meet their city-required licensing fees. She charged 2 points per week, but the genius of the structure was that she never collected violently. She collected by taking partial ownership of the businesses themselves, which by 1983 gave her a documented or undocumented stake in at least 22 Brooklyn businesses, including a licensed electrical contracting company that did work for the city. When asked by an associate in a 1980 wiretapped conversation how she thought about her position, Filippone said, "I don't run a crew. I run the math that the crew depends on. The entire Gambino family's enforcement capacity, at its peak in the late 1970s, generated an estimated $500 million annually. And Filippone's operation, by the FBI's own 1993 estimate, accounted for $34 million of that total from accounting and information services alone, a number so large it was quietly removed from the public version of the report. The most protected secret in Filippone's operation was not her criminal methods. It was the specific identities of the law enforcement figures who ensured those methods were never prosecuted in real time. Captain Bernard Scola, of the NYPD's 68th Precinct, whose district covered a significant portion of Filippone's Brooklyn operations, received a documented cash payment of $1,200 per month between 1976 and 1982, a total that the 2003 NYPD internal review confirmed, but attributed only to unspecified organized crime sources, without naming Filippone directly. Scola retired in 1984 with a full pension and died in 2001. No charges were ever filed against him. A 1987 grand jury in the Eastern District heard testimony from a former runner named Antoinette Calabrese, who described in specific detail how Scola's precinct had received advance notice before at least 3 scheduled raids on Filippone-controlled card games in 1979. That testimony was never entered into any subsequent trial record, and the assistant U.S. attorney who took Calabrese's statement, whose name appears in the grand jury transcript, left the Department of Justice in 1988 for a position at a private law firm that represented 2 Gambino-adjacent real estate companies. Antoinette Calabrese herself disappeared from the public record after her 1987 grand jury appearance. She is listed in no subsequent court documents, no witness protection registry entry has ever been made public under her name, and a 1991 missing persons report filed by her sister with the NYPD's 72nd Precinct was closed within 30 days as unfounded. The Mafia Queen series never showed you that because some facts are too large for a television drama to contain. On November 9, 1983, at approximately 11:40 p.m., a man named Giancarlo Vestri was shot 4 times in the parking lot of a diner on Highland Boulevard in Staten Island. Vestri was a mid-level figure who had been coordinating between Filippone's information brokering network and a separate Genovese-affiliated operation on the North Shore, and his death was officially classified by the NYPD as a robbery gone wrong, a conclusion reached despite the fact that Vestri's wallet, containing $340 in cash, was found undisturbed in his jacket pocket. The FBI's Organized Crime Division, working separately from the NYPD investigation, developed a different theory within 60 days of the shooting. 3 separate informants, identified in internal memos as Source Bravo 7, Source Foxtrot 12, and Source Delta 3, each independently described the Vestri shooting as a message sent by Filippone to the Genovese family after Vestri attempted to renegotiate the terms of an information-sharing arrangement without her authorization. In the 14 months preceding Vestri's death, 6 individuals connected to the overlap between Filippone's operation and Genovese territory had died under circumstances officially classified as accidents or unrelated homicides. The FBI's internal timeline, reconstructed in a 1994 memo, mapped those 6 deaths as a deliberate escalation pattern leading directly to November 9th, meaning Vestri's killing was not the beginning of a conflict, but the end of one. What remains from that night is a detail that appears in only one document. A waitress at the Highland Boulevard diner told detectives that Vestri had been eating alone and had ordered a second cup of coffee 3 minutes before he walked outside, which means the last ordinary thing Giancarlo Vestri ever did was decide he wanted more coffee. The violence that surrounded Filippone's operation between 1978 and 1988 was not contained to the participants. The neighborhoods where her numbers runners operated, Bensonhurst, Bay Ridge, and the North Shore of Staten Island, experienced a documented pattern of intimidation against small business owners who refused her loan offers. And the NYPD's own precinct logs from those years record 214 separate incidents of arson, vandalism, and assault against businesses in those zip codes that were never connected to organized crime in any official prosecution. In 1982 alone, 7 fires were reported at businesses on or near 18th Avenue in Bensonhurst, 4 of them within 1 block of a property where a Filippone-linked loan had been refused. The City of New York deployed no specific task force to address that pattern. The NYPD's Organized Crime Division was focused almost entirely on male-led hierarchies and the prosecution of figures with formal titles within the 5 families. And the 1983 Organized Crime Control Bureau Annual Report, a public document, contains 0 references to any female-led criminal operation anywhere in the 5 boroughs. Filippone's operation existed in that blind spot for over a decade, not because it was small, but because the institutional apparatus designed to find it had not built the category necessary to see it. The families most directly damaged by that violence were not criminals. They were grocers, tailors, and the owners of 2 competing dry cleaning businesses on 86th Street who spent 3 years paying for protection against threats that the police told them they could not verify. The Mafia Queen series spent 40 minutes on boardroom-style power struggles inside the Gambino hierarchy and spent 0 seconds on a single one of those families. Filippone was not brought down by a wiretap, an informant, or a coordinated federal task force. She was brought down by a real estate filing. In March 1989, she purchased a property in Breezy Point, Queens, through a shell company whose corporate structure contained a paperwork error, a transposed tax identification number that linked the shell directly to a separate LLC that a Treasury Department analyst named Patricia Morano had been tracking for 18 months as part of a money laundering investigation completely unrelated to organized crime. The vanity embedded in that purchase was not financial, it was geographic. Breezy Point in 1989 was a community where the NYPD's own retirees lived, where city workers bought summer homes, where a woman of Filippone's background could own a waterfront property and be surrounded by the same class of people whose institutional protection she had relied on for 2 decades. She wanted to live among them openly, which meant putting her name, however indirectly, on a document that a federal analyst could find. Morano's discovery triggered a cross-referencing audit that took 11 months and produced a 340-page financial analysis connecting Filippone's shell company network to 7 specific cash-intensive businesses, 4 of which had city contracts. The Eastern District indictment, filed on February 14, 1991, named Filippone as the primary defendant on 12 counts of racketeering, tax evasion, and conspiracy, and the lead prosecutor noted in his opening statement that the case had originated not from organized crime intelligence, but from a misfiled tax document. Every film version of her story ends with a dramatic confrontation. The real ending was a transposed number on a form that a Treasury analyst almost didn't flag because it was a Tuesday afternoon and she had 17 other files open on her desk. Her downfall was not the system catching up with her. It was the moment she decided that being seen was worth more to her than being safe. On February 14, 1992, exactly 1 year after her indictment, Maria Filippone sat in Courtroom 7 of the Eastern District Courthouse in Brooklyn and heard a jury foreperson deliver guilty verdicts on 9 of 12 counts. She did not react. A court officer who was present told an investigative journalist in 2004 that Filippone spent the 15 minutes between the verdict and the sentencing adjournment staring at a fixed point on the wall above the jury box, unblinking, her hands folded on the table in front of her. The empire did not end in a raid, or a chase, or a moment of cinematic violence. It ended in a beige federal courtroom, where a woman in a gray suit listened to her financial architecture described, line by line, by a prosecutor reading from documents she herself had created. She had bribed a police captain, controlled the finances of 3 Gambino revenue streams, brokered 47 hijackings, owned stakes in 22 businesses, and run a loan operation that reached into the city's own contracting infrastructure. She had done all of it for 19 years while remaining beneath the threshold of institutional recognition. She received a sentence of 22 years in federal prison, longer than any sentence handed to a Gambino capo in the same prosecutorial period, a fact that the sentencing judge acknowledged without explanation and the press did not report. She served her sentence at FCI Danbury in Connecticut, in a standard federal housing unit where cells measure approximately 6 feet by 9 feet, where the fluorescent light above the bunk operates on a timer that cannot be overridden by the occupant, and where the single window, positioned near the ceiling, provides indirect natural light for approximately 3 hours per day. She was released in 2009 at the age of 64 and has not spoken publicly since. The reason she fell was not Patricia Marano's diligence, not the Eastern District's resources, not the RICO statute. The reason she fell was that she had spent 19 years being invisible, and then, in March 1989, she chose a waterfront property in a neighborhood full of retired cops because she wanted to feel, for once, like she belonged to the world she had spent her entire life funding. That desire, for legitimacy, for arrival, for the right to be seen, is the oldest weakness in the architecture of power, and it has claimed every operator who ever built something large enough to believe it was permanent. Power at that scale requires absolute anonymity, and anonymity requires the willingness to want nothing that can be photographed, titled, or filed with a county clerk. The moment the wanting becomes visible, the structure begins to collapse from the inside. She chose the waterfront view. She chose the property record. She chose to exist, legally, in a community where her presence would be unremarkable. And that choice, made on a Tuesday afternoon with a pen over a real estate form, undid everything that 19 years of invisible precision had built. The courtroom in Brooklyn is still there. Beige walls and fluorescent light, the same fixed point above the jury box where she directed her gaze on the afternoon her life became a federal record. Somewhere in that room, in the grain of the wood or the hum of the overhead lighting, is the silence of a woman who built an empire that the city never officially admitted existed. And the question that silence leaves behind is not whether she was powerful, but whether the power was ever real, if the only people who fully understood it were the ones too compromised to say so out loud.